This loser. The goblins attacked his village, killed all the men, kidnapped all the females including his mom and sister, and started clapping them to produce a new generation, then killed them. So he took it personally and promised to make it a one-sided massacre. Our story begins with just a normal day, like any other day, where a holy maiden, a small one actually, goes to the adventure guild to sign up, and she meets a beginner team like her that wants one more member to start their first adventure. They took a goblin slaying task. The guild secretary tries to say maybe it's not a good idea to take this task as your first ever mission, but the dude says it's just some goblins. That's gonna be so easy, what could possibly go wrong? The mission is to rescue some girls kidnapped from a nearby village by goblins after they killed the men. The swordsman dude thinks this easy mission is just the start of his journey to slay dragons and defeat the demon lord one day. He still wonders why the goblins kidnap only the females, but that's not a problem for him. With this 3 chicks with him, that's the perfect start for his own harem. The dude literally knows he's the main character, but suddenly some goblins show up out of nowhere and surround the thick magician girl. She thinks that's a free kill and attacks them with fire magic. But the situation develops rapidly, and the goblins get her. They stab her in the stomach and start killing her, which gets the dude angry and starts slaying them for revenge, and they ask the small maiden to use her healing spells. The dude attacks and stabs the other goblins, but one stabs him in the leg and looks at him with mocking eyes. He screams and aims for his head with all his power, but his sword hits the cave roof and goblins take the chance to attack him and start stabbing our main character to death. The maiden healing magic isn't working on the magician. It's too late. The martial arts girl tells her to take the girl and run, and starts attacking the goblins with her fists and kicks, but suddenly a Giga Chad goblin shows up. The Giga Chad starts smashing her to the wall and gives her to the small goblins to start clapping her cheeks as well. She looks into the maiden eyes and says with her last breath, "Run." Only her screams fill the cave. The maiden takes the wounded magician and runs away, but an arrow hits her from the back and the goblins kick her away and start tearing the girl's clothes. Knowing she's next, the maiden wets her clothes, shaking in fear, and the goblins start laughing at her. But suddenly a stranger appears at the end of the tunnel. The goblin shots him with an arrow and jumps to attack him between his armored plates, but it failed and the armored man kills him instantly. The other goblins attempts to run, but a short sword hits his head and falls dead. The armored man says that's two, but the maiden asks him who you are, but he removes the arrow from her shoulder saying, "Goblin Slayer." Then he gives her a drug to heal her wounds, but she tells him to give it to the other girl. He says it's too late, the blade is poisoned. The dying magician tells him to end this pain, and he gets what she means and drags out his knife and makes it quick. He makes the maiden drink the antidote and asks if there was a big goblin, which she confirms it. He drags out some of the goblin blood to paint their bodies to hide the smell and goes to the attack point. He counts the dead goblin bodies and confirms his thoughts that the goblins did set a trap for them and made her companion use a long sword in a short cave, which is a beginner mistake. He asks her what abilities she has, but suddenly he attacks a hiding goblin, then sets up a plan to save her friends and the other kidnapped girls. They move slowly to not make any noise, and the goblin slayer tells her to do the holy light spell. He starts attacking, suddenly locating the shaman leader of the goblins and strikes him with the spear, then falls back running from the other goblins. He set up a trap for them and asks the maiden to use the holy light again on the big one. Once it falls down, he strikes him with a sword and spells oil on his body, then sends him rolling down the cave. Once the others get covered with the oil, he sets them on fire easily. The maiden screams that the fire might catch on the other girls, but he says it's not and waits for the other goblins to surprise them. The plan goes as planned and he kills the rest of them. They go back to the goblin base and the maiden sees the other girls and her teammate covered with goblin fluid. She tries to relieve her, but she's totally out of her consciousness. The goblin slayer finds there are already some kid goblins and says they are reproducing fast. They just need more time to have an army ready to eliminate the nearby villages. The maiden asks him if he's gonna do it, and he says yes. She tries to stop him, but he tells her that they hold grudges and will come after them. She falls on her knees hearing the goblin's screams, till it's totally done. Goblin Slayer comes out not caring about her crying, and says that's 22 goblin. Later, the rescued girls were sent to temples to recover. It's not that easy to forget having a goblin's meat. This is the normal day in adventure life. The maiden goes to the Goblin Slayer the next day, and says she bought an armored as he instructed, then asks if she can join him. He stays silent for a little while, then says I'm only interested in goblins. but the maiden says she's okay with that. They go to a far forest and watch the large tree that goblins took as their nest. Some of them are on guard and the others are dancing around the fire with the human girls they clapped and killed. Goblin Slayer asks the maiden to prepare fire arrows for him till she gets the perfect shots ready. He starts shooting the guards first, then shoots the rest of the nest till it catches fire as well. The inside goblins try to run from the nest, but he makes the maiden use the new spell she obtained, Protection, to block the entrance and trap all the goblins with the fire. The maiden can't believe that she's using the new miracle obtained from Mother Earth like this. He says that's the perfect use for it, to kill goblins. After a while, it starts raining, and Goblin Slayer says he's gonna hunt down the other goblins that run from the back before they get away. He checks the traps he set earlier and gives them the same fate as their fallen comrades. She asks him what grudges he has for the goblins to go this far. He starts remembering his childhood. The same day his friend was moving to live with her uncle wasn't a good memory for him. The goblins attacked their village and burned it down. Blood was everywhere, and his sister was being used by goblins while he was watching all this, hiding. Can't even save his family. Then he replies to the maiden, "It's nothing." At a farm, early in the morning, a red-haired girl wakes up and opens the window to greet her childhood friend. She chats with him while he's doing his daily routine, checking for any goblins' footprints because goblins do scout at night before they do any attack. If he didn't find any, he checks for other marks that they might have left. They then have breakfast and Goblin Slayer gives his rent to her uncle as usual, and then they get ready to leave for the city. He asks to help her but she says she's okay. She is carrying 2 heavy objects all day and night. She's used to this. They delivered the cheese to the shop owner who thanks her for her quality cheese, and then she gotta go to the adventure guild with Goblin Slayer. When other adventure sees Goblin Slayer, they trash talk about that weird guy who only takes goblins' quests. His armor that looks like a beginner, they can't believe he's silver rank like them. That's a pathetic weirdo who can't hunt big preys. But the guild opens the quests, and the childhood friend sees that the Goblin Slayer is waiting in silence. There is no rush for him since no one likes goblin slaying quests. She sees a maiden getting closer to him, saying burning the whole nest alive is going too far, but he says it's better than letting a goblin live. She says what if it didn't rain? The fire might have caught in the forest. He says this is even better. If a goblin ran, he would be burned alive as well. They kept this argument till the guild gets empty, then Goblin Slayer steps in to ask if there is goblin quest. Then he asks if some newbie party took a goblin quest or not and asks for their details to make sure they would be okay. Then he takes the maiden and goes to another goblin hunting task. His thick childhood friend decides to wait for him that till he's back. But he didn't. Several days have passed but there isn't a trace of him. Till the end of the week, he's finally back to the guild to report his task. Then he goes back to the farm and greets his cow friend. She asks him if he needs some milk. I got them bigger. But he replies, not interested. After a while, a hot elf comes to the guild girl to ask for information about someone. And all the other male adventurers are simping for her. But a dwarf steps in to explain to the guild girl who's the person they want. But neither of them can explain. So a lizard man steps in and says that his comrades are looking for a freak who only hunt goblins. But suddenly an armored dude steps inside the guild and says, "Did you say goblins? Where are they?" The guild girl points to the flat elf's party, so Goblin Slayer looks them in the eyes and says, "Are you goblins?" The elf says no, we were looking for you. But he says not interested. They explain that they want his help with a goblin-related issue, so he takes them to the meeting room and stops the small maiden from following him and tells her to take some rest. The maiden feels a little bit broken, but she waits in silence till a newbie party comes to ask her to join them. She tries to decline it, but they say they know about this freak dude who only hunts goblins and uses her as bait. She gets angry, but suddenly some big pillow steps into the scene and let the newbies go away. She's a big pillow thick mommy magician that has a little connection with that friend of the maiden. She tells her that he came one day asking her for a favor. He wanted her to open her gate for him. She thought she's gonna get his meat, but it turned out that he wanted a gate scroll. The human kings and the other races' leaders made an urgent meeting to stand against a great threat. The demon lord armies start attacking. The world is at risk. But Goblin Slayer says not interested. The elf gets mad at this shit, but the lizard man says they have goblins in their armies. He immediately agrees and start asking for detailed information about the situation. Then he leaves saying, "I'm going now, give the payment of the quest to the guild girl." Leaving them stunned, is this motherfucker gonna fight the demon lord's armies alone? Didn't he just get back from a mission? But they catch up to him with the maiden girl as well. Their destination is the elf's land, and they decided to make a camp midway to rest and get to know each other. Everyone starts to share something that he got from home to introduce their own culture, till they got to the dude who didn't take off his helmet at all. He says what if he got unconscious from a goblin's sudden attack, but he decides to share a cheese with them, and they all were amazed to see this type of cheese. It tastes too soft and amazing like heaven, so they ask him where did he get this from. He says, I know a good cow. The elf tries to sneak to touch his gears, but suddenly Goblin Slayer's voice rises up warning. She asks how did he get these ancient scrolls, at least tell us what it has. He says no, what if goblins capture you and you tell them about my backup plans? The elf gets annoyed and says, don't I look pretty to you? What if I give you a head, then you tell me? He immediately says not interested. They reach the elf's land, and Goblin Slayer plans to attack early in the morning because it's like late night for the goblins. He makes the elf shoots the 2 guards first and their pet wolf. Finally, it's time to slay some goblins. Goblin Slayer goes to extract the blood, but the flat elf asks what the hell are you doing to the corpse? He says you gonna paint your body to cover the smell. She screams someone stop this freak, but the maiden tells her not to worry much about it, you will get used to it. The elf screams this is so gross. The maiden tells her she can wash it later, but the smell won't go this easily. They are inside an old shrine that tells the story of the old war times. But Goblin Slayer can't see any marks for a shaman leader, which leads to one thing. There is something else leading these goblins. They ask him what would he do normally in cases like this. He says there are a lot of options. I can smoke them to die choked, or burn them alive and block the exits, or sink them in the river, but sometimes I can poison their water source. The elf's face can tell what the fuck did the goblins do to you to deserve this. They start smelling an awful smell, and Goblin Slayer tells them to keep going till they reach a room where the goblins keep their waste and the hostage elf girls that they used as a toy. There was a goblin hiding, but Goblin Slayer didn't fall for this trap and kills it. The lizard warrior summons a skeleton lizard soldier to get the hostage to the elf's land safely. They keep sneaking into every part of the nest, killing the guards while scanning it to set a plan. He checks what tools and spells are left before they move again, but the elf is angry because of the humiliation they did to her people, and Goblin Slayer tells her, it's so simple, if a goblin made a problem, kill the goblin, the problem is solved. And they sneak to the shrine center to find all the other goblins gathered there like they own the place. When the night comes, one of the goblins wakes up lazily to see a dwarf dancing and casting a sleeping spell. Then the maiden girl casts the silence spell, so no one hears any noise. And then the other 3 start moving to slay the goblins, one by one. The flat elf releases their anger on them while Goblin Slayer just does one hit kill. And he used their weapons to slay them after his got drenched with blood. After it's finally done, they search for their leader. But suddenly they hear large footsteps and a giant ogre shows up. Goblin Slayer says that's bad, you are not a goblin. The ogre screams how dare you, I was granted this army by one of the demon lord generals. It starts attacking and they dodge it, but he casts the large fireball, and the maiden uses the protection miracle to save them, till she can't hold it any longer. The elf girl spreads and shoots his eye with an arrow, and the other starts attacking him at the same time. And Goblin Slayer attacks his legs, but the wounds heal again and the ogre sends him flying and hits the wall badly. The ogre tells them they will pay for this humiliation. He will cut their limbs and clap these 2 female checks in front of them. But they keep attacking him from all sides to earn time for the maiden to save Goblin Slayer. They keep fighting till finally he wakes up. Goblin Slayer asks the maiden to describe the situation for him. Then he asks her to get his healing and stamina potions. He goes directly to the ogre general, who says you really got the nerve. I will let your girl lie, but I'm gonna use her to rebuild the goblin army. And start casting a file spell again to attack them. But suddenly the light spreads in front of him and he sees his limbs being cut till it cuts him in half. The ogre opens his eyes to see Goblin Slayer coming at him with a scroll burning in his hand, and screams what the hell did you do? He says that's a gate scroll I connected to the bottom of the sea, and used the water pressure as blades to cut your ass. What a waste, I was saving it for goblins. The ogre screams you plan to use this against goblins, what the fuck is wrong with you? But Goblin Slayer steps on his face and says the goblins are more troublesome than you, I'm not interested. Then he strikes the sword to the head and finishes him. After they are done, Goblin Slayer gets back to the farm, and the first thing he does is to check for any goblin scout traces as usual. His friend comes to ask him how his quest was. He tells her that he's out of cheese and asks her to produce more milk for it. The guild gets a report of the quest. Goblin Slayer party defeated one of the Demon Lord General's troops. The other girl teases the blondie. "Isn't this your boy?" And she says it's nothing like that. Later that day, one of the newbie adventurers lost his sword and couldn't complete the last task. Now he's out of money and can't afford another sword. He tries to borrow some weapons from other adventurers, but they tell him that he can't handle their magical weapon that will consume his life. He finds no other option but to ask Goblin Slayer for advice, the same dude he did trash talk before. He asks him what would he do if he lost his weapon in a quest. He says that's simple, I steal one from a goblin. He replies it's not a goblin. So Goblin Slayer asks him if he only used to use swords, which he confirms, and then he gathers other information about the situation. He says it's better to use a club in this case. Throw, stab, break, and shatter. It's easier to use and will cause much damage, at least till you get back your sword. The boy did as he was told, and it really worked for him. He got back his sword and the other adventurers make a party to congratulate him. While Goblin Slayer is still waiting in the guild for any coming goblin quests, the blondie guild girl comes to ask him something. He asks, "Goblins?" She hesitates to explain, but he says not interested and leaves already. She begs him to at least wait and hear her first. She asks him if he knows the Holy Sword Maiden. He says no, not interested. She says that she was one of the heroes' party that defeated the old demon lord, and she's asking him personally. He says not interested and leaves again, but she stops him saying she called him by the name Goblin Slayer, which means it might be related to goblins. He goes to gather the flat elf party that was with the last quest, but once he enters the place he hears the adventurers' celebration, a great event. The hero party defeated the Demon Lord Generals. He ignores them and goes to his party directly and says one thing. It's time to slay some goblins. They were about to leave after their mission is done, but they say it's okay to do one more quest with him. They reach the Water Town, one of the most beautiful cities in the Empire. The Temple of Law, that's where the person who requested the help is. The small maiden can't believe it, and asks if the client is a priest of the Supreme God. Goblin Slayer says no, they are the Archbishop of the Supreme God. The small maiden can't believe what she just heard, and froze in her place. The person in charge of the law all across the western frontier. She isn't a hero from some old legends. She's a living gold ranker adventurer who was one of the heroes that defeated the Demon Lord in the past. The Archbishop beloved by the Supreme God, the Holy Sword Maiden. Goblin Slayer sees a thick mommy maiden with black bandages covering her eyes. They introduce themselves and apologize for coming even if they weren't invited. They are here to help. When it's Goblin Slayer's turn to introduce himself, he gets to the subject directly saying, "Where are the goblins?" They stop this freak and let the holy thick mommy maiden explain what's the issue. She says there were kidnapping and killing crimes rising recently, till one day one of the adventurers killed a shadow figure and found out that it was a goblin. A goblin here in the Water Town. This was impossible, and she sent a great team of adventurers to scout this, but no one came back alive, till she heard the song of the great and brave Goblin Slayer. This is the first time Goblin Slayer knows he's a famous one, and there are songs about him in the Empire. The Flat Elf says that's how we got to know about you. Even so, she's kinda disappointed after she met him for real. He says not interested. Let's get to the goblin part immediately. They stop him and say this time will be with 3 conditions. No burning the goblins alive, no drowning them in the river, and no matter what, no poison. He gets shocked to hear no poison, but in the end he agrees. They gather more information about the city and come to the conclusion that the goblins are using the underground passes and that there might be something big going on. She tried to ask the Empire for help, but she was told that there was no point in mobilizing the military against mere goblins. They get a map of the underground, and Goblin Slayer says we need to scout and navigate first before we set a plan to attack. While leaving, the thick maiden stops the small one saying, "This might be rude to ask, but aren't you afraid?" She says I'm afraid, but she's sure that everything will be okay with him, the person she trusts the most. They go to underground tunnels to discover the area. They are afraid to get into some traps, but Goblin Slayer tells them not to worry. It's brick walls here, not a cave, and they can't set many traps here. And says not to worry much about the smell here, as they can only smell shit here. They start hearing some noise, then they see that the roof is leaking water. It's raining outside. But the elf suddenly tells them to stop moving, till she confirms that something is coming, and they all run to take positions. Suddenly, a boat jumps into the light. It's a goblin's boat. The maiden cast a protection spell to defend them from the arrow's attack. Goblin Slayer starts thinking of what to do, and they immediately remind him of the 3 conditions he's prohibited from using. He tells the dwarf to cast a spell that digs a big hole in the underground to make a tornado that swallows the goblin. But they say, actually, it's 4 conditions. Goblin Slayer is only left with the hardest plane. He throws his sword to kill the boat leader, then gets out a jar of special powder for the goblins. And once the protection spell is over, he throws the jar on the boat, which makes the goblins start screaming in pain. Then he jumps to engage with them, and the lizard man joins him, and kills what they can, till they get outnumbered. Goblin Slayer tells the lizard man to use his tail to send the goblins flying out of the boat, then jumps to finish the rest. The dwarf screams the spell is ready, and suddenly a giant rock falls from the sky to destroy the boat totally, and send what's left of the goblins into the water. They stop to enjoy the scene in front of them, but suddenly the flat elf feels something, and before they can react, a giant white crocodile jumps to catch one of the drowning goblins. Goblin Slayer says that's not a goblin, not interested. But they scream at him, "What the fuck is wrong with you, run?" They scream at the lizard man, "Isn't this one of your siblings? Tell him not to eat us. He says he's from the bad side of the family." But the flat elf feels something else in front of them. More goblins' boats. There is quite a number of them. They tell Goblin Slayer to do something. He asks if the poison option is available. But they say no, you're gonna affect the nature in the area. In the front, there are many of the goblins' boats that see a light getting closer to them. They show a smug facial reaction and prepare, but suddenly a giant white crocodile jumps at them and starts preparing for his dinner. They are the dinner. The maiden did actually cast the holy light spell on the crocodile's tail to trick the goblins. They ask Goblin Slayer how the fuck he came up with this idea. He says the goblins here learned that the adventurers move with light, so he decided to use this against them, and concludes that the goblins here didn't learn to ride boats by themselves. They didn't multiply naturally. Which means that something, or someone is down there teaching this creature, and they get back to get some rest and prepare for the attack. Goblin Slayer goes to send a letter, and the others have things to do. The small maiden takes a hot bath, and gets interrupted by a thick figure, the holy thick mommy sword maiden. The small maiden can't help looking at how big the difference between them. It's like an apple besides a watermelon. The thick maiden asks her about her companion, and tells her to not put all her hopes on him. He will just disappear one day like the others. The flat elf goes to check on Goblin Slayer if he sent his letter or not, but the other adventurers still talk to her back. What a waste, such a check with this weird dude. Goblin Slayer did send the letter, but he notices something weird in the quest list. Even with this large underground, there is no single slaying rats task at all. He thinks much about it and then decides to go buy something. A canary. They enter the underground gates again while asking why he brought this bird. He tells them that the canaries can sense even the slightest hint of poison gas, and they panic. Goblin Slayer decided to go to the upstream water where the boats came from, and try to avoid running into goblins. They keep searching the area to discover that it's actually a grave for old warriors, but now it's a nest for goblins, till they get to a weird big room door. They kick the door ready for the battle, but nothing is there except for a tied-up female warrior. The maiden rushes to help her, but the goblin stops her to find out that it's only a skeleton. They get locked inside. They fall for the trap. Goblin Slayer tells them to calm down, cause they are still alive. But suddenly the canary panics like crazy, which means there is poison being fed to the room. Goblin Slayer gives them charcoal, and tells them to warp it in a piece of cloth, then hold it over the nose and mouth to protect them from the poison. Then throws 2 bags of quicklime and volcanic earth on the dwarf and tells him to mix them up and block all the holes in the wall immediately. It's like a concrete. They move a large gravestone in front of the door to block the entrance while getting ready for the attack. The lizard man casts Dragonic Skeleton Warrior spell, and the maiden casts a protection spell, and they wait. Suddenly the voices calm down, and they wonder what's going on. Goblin Slayer tells them that the poison flow reversed cause we blocked the holes. Now some of them did die already, but not all. The goblins start breaking the door, and the elf screams she can't count their footsteps. There is something else out there. Suddenly a huge club smashes the entrance wide open. Then a big goblin enters the room. Goblin Slayer tells them not to die. That's a goblin champion. They engage with goblins from behind the protection spell. Then Goblin Slayer makes a mess out of the goblins, then he jumps into the champion. The huge monster uses a small goblin as a shield to defend the strike. Then he hits Goblin Slayer with full force and smashes him into the column, then he falls to the gravestone. The maiden rushes to him screaming, but she sees blood going out of him like crazy. She knows that he's dying already, and the fear takes over her. She panics and loses control of the protection spell and lets the goblin in. The goblins attack the others, especially the flat elf, and tears her clothes to start clapping her. But the champion goes directly to the maiden. She wet her clothes of fear, but he suddenly grabs her with one hand and gets closer to her, then takes a bit out of her flesh while she screams in pain and blood raining out of her. Goblin Slayer's body starts shaking as he tries to move, but he can't. He can only see the roof and hear the screams of the others through his helmet. He hears a voice in his mind shouting, "You think you can slay them? You only watched and did nothing while they killed your sister after they enjoyed her." "Bullshit," he replies to himself. Then he forces his hand to grab the edge. He takes a potion, then slowly moves to a goblin and smashes his head with the shield. He grabs the fallen blonde hair of the skeleton and sneaks behind the champion while he is about to get another bite, then suddenly starts choking him with the hair. The champion starts moving like crazy and drops the small maiden, while the goblin slayer's body can't keep up. The monster starts smashing other goblins, which gives a chance for the others to stand again and fight back. He says to the big goblin, "Didn't you enjoy your meal? Take this," and smashes his fist into the goblin's eyes, then falls down. He grabs a spear and starts attacking other goblins. Who's next? I'm still hungry. But the fear of the predator hits the goblins' hearts, and they start running after their champion. Goblin Slayer doesn't stop and goes after them, but the elf stops him and helps him to stand and move too slowly with his injuries to go check on his maiden. He assures her that everything is okay and grabs her hand to say that stuff like this happens, so it's okay. But he suddenly falls dead corpse, and only the blood coming from his helmet, while they are all silent looking with frozen faces. The morning light fills the room, and a white-haired dude wakes up with a body full of scars. He notices the small blonde maiden sleeping next to him. He takes a breath and then covers her pretty figure with the blanket. He sits next to his armor and tries to gather what happened. But he hears the thick holy mommy maiden, but without a cover on her eyes, and it's clear she didn't get a chance to wear anything under her dress. She gets closer to him and says, "So, how did this thing feel, sharing a bed with the two of us?" The dude literally went from Goblin Slayer to Pussy Slayer.